Before his name was a curse, it was a prayer. Before Hooverville became a synonym for the shanty towns of the Great Depression, the name Herbert Hoover was a symbol of hope for millions of starving people in post-war Europe. He was the great humanitarian, a living saint, a man who had saved entire nations. This is the story of a fall from grace so complete, it remains one of the most misunderstood chapters in American history. A story that asks a devastating question. How does a man who saved the world become the man who is blamed for the ruin of his own country? To understand Herbert Hoover, you must understand the land that made him. He was born in 1874 in West Branch, Iowa, a small, quiet village built on the Quaker faith. It was a world of simplicity, hard work, and an unwavering faith in community. His father, Jesse Hoover, was a blacksmith and a small store owner. His mother, Huldah Minthorn Hoover, was an educated woman and a noted Quaker minister, a rarity for women in those days. Quaker life revolved around the inner light, the belief that there was a part of God in every individual. This fostered a culture of equality, integrity, and a deep sense of responsibility to the community. But it also emphasized a core principle: self-reliance. The community would help those in need, but the expectation was that each individual would do his or her best first. To accept charity was to admit not just to hardship, but to a failure of one's own character. These values were ingrained in the soul of young Bert Hoover. They formed his moral compass, one that would guide him through both the most glorious successes and the most painful tragedies. This safe, orderly world came crashing down. When Hoover was only 6 years old, his father died suddenly of typhoid fever. The shock shook the family, but his resilient mother kept them going. Tragedy did not let up, however. Just 3 years later, Huldah also died of pneumonia. At the age of 9, Herbert Hoover became an orphan. This double loss became the hidden wound that shaped his destiny, a quiet force that would drive the rest of his life. Young Bert and his siblings were separated, sent to live with various relatives. Hoover was sent to live with his uncle, Allen Hoover, on a nearby farm. A year later, he was sent further afield to Newberg, Oregon, to live with another uncle, Dr. John Minthorn. He was never abused or deprived, but he was always an outsider in someone else's home, a constant guest. The pain of losing his parents and the instability that followed taught him a harsh lesson. The world is inherently a chaotic place, and survival depends on one's own strength and perseverance. He became fiercely independent, somewhat aloof, and possessed an extraordinary ability to focus on the task at hand. He learned to hide his emotions behind a calm, competent exterior. The orphan was determined to build a life so solid that no tragedy could ever shake it. He built a fortress of self-reliance, not knowing that those very defenses would one day keep him from seeing the pain of a broken nation. In 1891, an opportunity presented itself. A pioneering new university, Stanford University, opened in California. It promised a practical, tuition-free education for students of talent and drive. For a young man with no money but a sharp mind and burning ambition, this was the way out. At age 17, Hoover headed west to become a member of Stanford's first class, the Pioneer Class. He failed all but one of his entrance exams, except mathematics. But a geology professor, seeing a spark of determination in the young Quaker, persuaded the school to accept him conditionally. Life at Stanford was a constant struggle. To cover his living expenses, he showed a natural talent for organization. He set up a student laundry service, a newspaper delivery business, and even ran a speaking agency. He wasn't just learning geology, he was learning to manage systems and people. It was also at the Stanford Geology Lab that he met the woman who would become his partner in all his future adventures. Lou Henry. She was an extraordinary woman for her time, smart, independent, and the only female geology student at the school. She was from Waterloo, Iowa, not far from Hoover's hometown. She shared his love of science and the outdoors, and she had a tough spirit to match his. They were kindred spirits, two self-made souls destined to face the world together. After graduating in 1895, Hoover began working as a miner in California, pushing a wheelbarrow underground 7 days a week. But his ambitions were much bigger. He had taken a job with Buick, Moring and Company, a leading mining firm based in London. His first assignment? The harsh, dusty goldfields of Western Australia. At 23, Hoover traveled to one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. He traveled hundreds of miles on camelback through the scorching outback, sleeping under the stars, analyzing rock formations with a keen eye. He was more than a geologist. He was a leader. He revolutionized mining methods, cutting costs and increasing production. He won the respect of the hardy Australian miners, who initially scoffed at the young American. Within 2 years, he had risen from a lowly engineer to mine manager. His success attracted attention. The Chinese government, looking to modernize its mining industry, offered him a prestigious position. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But before he began this new chapter, he had a personal matter to attend to. From Australia, he sent a telegram to Lou Henry in California, proposing marriage. She telegraphed back a single word, yes. He hurried back to America. They were married on February 10, 1899, at the home of the bride's parents. There was no honeymoon. The next day, the newlyweds boarded a steamship bound for China. They had entered an ancient empire on the brink of violent upheaval. They arrived in Tianjin in 1899, a bustling port city where Western interests collided with an increasingly restive Chinese culture. The Hoovers settled in quickly. Lou began to learn Mandarin, and Herbert went deep into surveying the country's vast coal reserves. They bought a house, and for a short time, life seemed promising. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Resentment against foreign influence had been simmering for years. A secret society known as the Boxers had emerged with a single goal: to destroy foreign devils and Chinese Christians. In the summer of 1900, the storm hit. The Boxer Rebellion raged across northern China. They laid siege to foreign fortifications in Beijing and Tianjin. Suddenly, Herbert Hoover, a 26-year-old engineer, found himself in the middle of a war. Tianjin was under siege. Thousands of foreigners and Chinese Christians were crammed into a small settlement, surrounded by tens of thousands of Boxer soldiers and imperial troops. The artillery began to rain down. In the chaos of the siege, the quiet Quaker engineer was transformed. A natural leader emerged. While others panicked, Hoover remained remarkably calm. With his engineering skills, he organized the construction of fortifications. He set up a system of water and food distribution, ensuring that scarce supplies were shared fairly. He led volunteer fire brigades, rushing into burning buildings under artillery fire. And Lou was right there with him. She refused to be a passive, frightened woman. She learned to shoot a pistol, cycled the perimeter of the settlement, and worked tirelessly in the makeshift hospital, tending to the wounded. Once, a shell exploded in their house while she was playing solitaire. She simply moved calmly into another room and continued her game. They were an unshakable team facing death with calm courage. For more than a month, they lived under constant bombardment, facing starvation and disease. It was a brutal test of courage that forged him into a leader. When an international relief force finally broke the siege, Herbert Hoover emerged as a hero. He had not only survived, he had led. The siege branded him with a core belief. In a world ruled by chaos, only order and organization stood between survival and destruction. After the uprising, Hoover remained in China, helping to rebuild the mining industry. But his reputation for extraordinary ability had spread. He returned to work for Buick Moring, becoming a partner in the firm at the age of 28. Over the next decade, he became a global doctor of troubled minds. He traveled the world to Burma, Russia, Egypt, India, turning failing minds into enormously profitable enterprises. He developed a management philosophy based on efficiency, technical expertise, and fair treatment of workers. By 1914, at the age of 40, Herbert Hoover had achieved everything an orphan from Iowa could have dreamed of. He was a self-made millionaire, one of the most respected mining engineers in the world. He lived in London with Lou and their two young sons, Herbert Jr. and Alan. He had built a life of order, security, and great success. He could have retired, enjoyed the fruits of his labors, and disappeared from the world stage. But in August of that year, shots rang out in Sarajevo. A world war had begun. And once again, Herbert Hoover found himself at the center of a historic crisis. He was about to face a task most people thought impossible, a challenge that would not only transform his life, but would forge a new identity for him. No longer just a wealthy businessman, but a global symbol of compassion. The skills that had made him a master engineer were about to be tested on a global scale, transforming him from a builder of minds into a savior of nations. And the first crisis that would test this new chapter of his life began not in a distant gold mine, but right where he was living. As war erupted in August of 1914, Hoover, now a private citizen in London, found himself facing a sudden, unexpected challenge. He had engineered a life of perfect order and astounding success, a fortress against the chaos that had defined his childhood. But in August of 1914, the ordered world he knew was set ablaze. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo had triggered a cascade of alliances and ultimatums, plunging Europe into the Great War. As nations mobilized for slaughter, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. Thousands of American tourists holidaying across Europe were suddenly stranded. Borders slammed shut, banks froze assets, and panic set in. Trapped in London with no money and no way home, a desperate committee of Americans sought out the one man they knew had the organizational genius to solve an impossible problem. Herbert Hoover, a private citizen, was asked to help. He immediately turned his London office into a relief headquarters. He and his staff worked around the clock, cashing checks on his own personal credit, securing passage on ships, and coordinating with overwhelmed embassies. In 6 weeks, he helped 120,000 Americans get home. It was a masterclass in logistics and a profound act of public service. Hoover asked for no credit and took no payment, but this frantic 6-week rescue mission was merely a dress rehearsal. Across the English Channel, a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable proportions was unfolding, and history was about to call his name once more. The German war machine had smashed its way through neutral Belgium, a small nation caught between warring giants. To starve Germany into submission, the British Royal Navy had thrown a tight blockade around all German-controlled ports. The consequence was as brutal as it was unintended. 7 million Belgian civilians, along with 2 million more in German-occupied northern France, were trapped in the middle. Their food supplies were cut off. They faced mass starvation. The world watched in horror, but governments were paralyzed. The British wouldn't lift the blockade, and the Germans wouldn't take responsibility for feeding the population they had just brutally occupied. Diplomats wrung their hands, but no one acted. A small group of American businessmen in Brussels, desperate to find a solution, sent an envoy to London. Their target was, once again, Herbert Hoover. The request was audacious, almost ludicrous. They asked this private mining engineer to create and lead a neutral, privately funded organization that would be allowed to ship food through an active naval blockade into an active war zone occupied by a hostile army and distribute it to 10 million people. It was a task that defied all logic and precedent. It required the trust of the suspicious Germans, the permission of the stubborn British, and hundreds of millions of dollars that didn't exist. Any sane person would have said it was impossible. Hoover, however, wasn't just any person. He was an engineer who believed no problem was unsolvable. He accepted the challenge without hesitation. E immediately suspended his business career, resigning from directorships that paid him over $100,000 a year, an immense sum at the time. He would work for free, dedicating himself entirely to the cause. He created the Commission for Relief in Belgium, or the CRB. It would become the greatest humanitarian relief effort the world had ever seen. For the next 4 years, Hoover became, in effect, the head of his own neutral state. He operated out of London, a whirlwind of ceaseless activity. His first task was diplomacy. He had to personally negotiate with the highest levels of the British and German governments. In Britain, he faced the formidable Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, who saw the relief effort as a potential loophole that could aid the enemy. Hoover, the quiet Quaker, argued his case with a relentless logic and a stubborn refusal to take no for an answer. He convinced them. In Germany, he navigated the treacherous corridors of the German General Staff, persuading suspicious officers that his organization was purely humanitarian and posed no military threat. He was a man with no official title, representing no government, yet he was negotiating the fate of millions with the most powerful men in Europe. With a fragile diplomatic agreement in place, the logistical nightmare began. Hoover had to find food, buy it, and ship it. He turned to his home country, America, raising funds and purchasing vast quantities of wheat, beans, and bacon. He then chartered his own fleet of ships, which sailed under the CRB's own neutral flag, a flag that soon became a symbol of hope on the high seas. This Hoover Navy had to navigate mine-filled waters and the constant threat of U-boat attacks. Once the food reached the port of Rotterdam in the neutral Netherlands, the hardest part began. It had to be moved into occupied Belgium and distributed. Under Hoover's direction, the CRB, working with a network of 40,000 Belgian volunteers, created a distribution system of breathtaking efficiency. They controlled mills, bakeries, and thousands of soup kitchens. Every sack of flour was meticulously accounted for to ensure it reached civilians and was not confiscated by the German army. Hoover's organization fed over 10 million people every single day for 4 years. They provided special meals for malnourished children and rations for expectant mothers. Without him, an entire generation of Belgians might have perished. Across the starving towns of Belgium, his name was whispered like a prayer. Children were taught to thank Herbert Hoover in their nightly prayers. The Belgians even coined a new word, hoovering, which meant to help or to save. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a global symbol of hope, the great humanitarian. When the United States finally entered the war in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson knew exactly who to call. He summoned Hoover back to America to become the head of the U.S. Food Administration. His task was monumental: feed America, its army, and its allies. Many expected him to impose mandatory rationing, as had been done across Europe. But that wasn't Hoover's way. Drawing on his Quaker faith in voluntary action, he launched a massive public relations campaign. He appealed to the patriotism and conscience of the American people. He introduced meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, urging families to conserve food so that more could be sent to the soldiers at the front. He printed posters with slogans like "Food will win the war" and distributed recipe books for saving sugar and flour. The response was overwhelming. Through purely voluntary means, American food consumption dropped by 15%. He had engineered the nation's diet, not through force but through persuasion. When the war ended in 1918, Hoover's work was far from over. Europe lay in ruins. Famine, revolution, and disease stalked the continent. President Wilson asked him to stay and lead the American Relief Administration, expanding his operations to feed a starving continent. He directed aid to dozens of countries, from Finland to Armenia. But his greatest moral test came in 1921. A catastrophic famine had erupted in Soviet Russia. The Bolshevik regime, led by Vladimir Lenin, was America's ideological enemy. Many in the U.S. argued fiercely against helping a communist government that had sworn to destroy capitalism. They called it aiding the enemy. Hoover disagreed. In a statement that would define his humanitarian creed, he declared, 20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed. For him, human suffering transcended politics. He negotiated directly with the Soviets, and for the next 2 years, his organization fed millions of Russians, saving the nascent communist state from utter collapse. Even his staunchest political opponents had to admit his integrity. By the time he returned to America for good, Herbert Hoover was arguably the most admired man in the country, perhaps even the world. He was a political superstar, courted by both Democrats and Republicans. He chose to serve as Secretary of Commerce under President Warren G. Harding and later Calvin Coolidge. Most people saw it as a minor, sleepy cabinet post. Hoover saw it as an opportunity to engineer an entire national economy. He transformed the Department of Commerce into a powerhouse. He believed in a concept he called associationalism, the idea that government should be a partner, not a master, encouraging private industries to cooperate to set standards, improve safety, and eliminate waste. He pushed for the 8-hour workday and an end to child labor. He standardized hundreds of products, from nuts and bolts to car tires and baby bottles, saving consumers billions of dollars. He foresaw the future, championing the new and revolutionary technologies of radio and commercial aviation, establishing the regulations that would allow them to flourish. He was the super secretary, the tireless prophet of a new American era of efficiency and prosperity. Then, in the spring of 1927, came one final dramatic test. The Mississippi River, swollen with relentless rain, burst its banks in the greatest natural disaster in American history up to that time. An area the size of Scotland was underwater. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless. President Coolidge, a man known for his hands-off approach, knew who to turn to. He put Herbert Hoover in charge of the entire relief and rescue operation. Hoover descended on the disaster zone and took command. He established a private corporation to raise funds, mobilize the National Guard and the Red Cross, and set up a massive network of refugee camps, complete with sanitation and medical care. He personally toured the flooded regions, coordinating the rescue of stranded families. The press followed his every move, hailing him as a miracle worker. Once again, when America faced chaos, the great engineer had imposed order and saved the day. This triumph cemented his public image as the nation's indispensable man, the ultimate can-do savior who had never known failure. When President Coolidge chose not to run for re-election in 1928, Hoover was the obvious Republican heir, running on a platform of continued prosperity and promising a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. He won in one of the most decisive landslides in American history. In March 1929, Herbert Hoover took the oath of office. He stood at the absolute zenith of his power and prestige, a global hero entrusted with the leadership of the most prosperous nation on earth. He had reached the pinnacle, promising to apply his engineering genius to eliminate poverty itself. No president had ever entered the White House with such a towering reputation for competence, and no president was about to face a more devastating, more complete, and more tragic fall from grace. The world was about to be plunged into an economic darkness that no amount of engineering could fix, and the man who had saved millions was about to be blamed for the suffering of millions more. On March 4th, 1929, Herbert Hoover stood before the nation and took the oath of office as the 31st President of the United States. The sky above Washington was clear, and the future of the country seemed just as bright. He had arrived at the pinnacle of power on a tidal wave of public adoration. In his inaugural address, his voice rang with the unshakable confidence of a man who had only ever known success. "I have no fears for the future of our country," he declared. "It is bright with hope." He was not just a politician. He was the great engineer, determined to apply science and efficiency to the working of society itself. He planned to reorganize government, champion child welfare, and, in his most audacious goal, build a nation free from poverty. For the first 7 months of his presidency, the work began. He was an activist president, pushing for reforms in the justice system, expanding national parks, and convening conferences on public health. He worked with the same relentless 18-hour-a-day intensity that had defined his entire life. The American economy, already booming, seemed to be roaring into a permanent golden age. But beneath the glittering surface of the Roaring Twenties, a dangerous instability was growing. For years, the stock market had been fueled by a frenzy of speculation. Ordinary people, lured by the promise of easy riches, had poured their life savings into stocks, often buying on margin, borrowing money to purchase shares they couldn't afford. It was a national gamble, a skyscraper of paper wealth built on a foundation of debt. Hoover, the cautious engineer, had privately worried about this orgy of speculation for years, but as president, he felt his power to intervene was limited. He issued quiet warnings, but they were lost in the roar of the bull market. On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, the stock market began to shudder. Panic selling started. A group of powerful Wall Street bankers managed to prop it up, temporarily halting the slide, but the confidence was gone. 5 days later, on Tuesday, October the 29th, the floor fell out completely. The great crash had begun. In a single day, the market lost billions of dollars, wiping out the fortunes of investors big and small. It was a financial earthquake, and it sent shock waves of fear across a nation that had come to believe its prosperity was invincible. In the face of this crisis, any previous president would likely have done nothing. The conventional wisdom of the time was that economic panics were like natural storms. They were destructive, but they would eventually pass, and the government's role was to stay out of the way. But Herbert Hoover was not a conventional president. He was the master problem solver, the man who had stared down famine and war. He refused to sit idly by. His response was immediate, energetic, and, for its time, utterly revolutionary. Just weeks after the crash, he summoned the nation's industrial titans to the White House, men like Henry Ford, Alfred Sloan, and Pierre Dupont. He sat them down and extracted a pledge. They would not cut wages. This was unheard of. In every previous downturn, wage cuts had been the first automatic response. Hoover believed that maintaining purchasing power was key to recovery. He then called in labor leaders and secured a promise from them not to strike. He met with governors and mayors, urging them to accelerate spending on public works projects, roads, bridges, and dams. This was Hoover's core philosophy, associationalism, in action. Government acting as a catalyst to spur voluntary, cooperative action from the private sector and local communities. But the crisis was more than just a stock market crash. It was the start of a global economic collapse, a deflationary spiral that no one understood. Despite Hoover's efforts, the economy continued to contract. Businesses failed, factories closed, and the grim tide of unemployment began to rise. Seeing that his voluntary approach was not enough, Hoover pushed his intervention further than any president had before him. He asked Congress for a massive tax cut, which passed. He then persuaded Congress to double the federal budget for public works. This led to the creation of some of the most iconic structures of the 20th century. The Hoover Dam, a colossal monument of concrete and steel rising from the desert, was the most famous of these projects, but across the country, federal dollars were funding the construction of everything from the San Francisco Bay Bridge to government buildings in Washington, D.C. Still, the abyss deepened. A wave of bank failures swept the nation as terrified citizens rushed to withdraw their savings. In 1931, Hoover took his most radical step yet. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC. This was, in essence, a massive government-owned bank with a staggering $2 billion at its disposal, an almost unbelievable sum for the time. The RFC's job was to lend money directly to struggling banks, railroads, insurance companies, and agricultural organizations to keep them from going under. It was the largest and most significant government intervention into the American economy in history up to that point. He was trying to save the entire system from the top down, hoping the benefits would eventually trickle down to the average citizen. So why, then, is he remembered as the president who did nothing? This question lies at the very heart of the Hoover tragedy. For all his unprecedented actions, there was one line he would not cross, one principle he held so sacred that he would rather risk his presidency than violate it. He would not provide direct federal relief to the unemployed. To Hoover, giving a man money from the federal government, what he called the dole, was not an act of compassion. It was a spiritual poison. He believed it would strip away a person's self-respect, their initiative, their will to work. It would destroy what he called their spiritual muscle. This conviction was not born of cruelty, but from the deepest wellsprings of his own life. He was the orphan from Iowa who had made his own way in the world. He was the Quaker who believed in the power of individual effort and community responsibility. In his mind, relief was the job of neighbors, helping neighbors, of local charities like the Red Cross, of city and state governments. The federal government, he believed, had no constitutional or moral right to step into that role. But this crisis was unlike anything America had ever seen. The need was simply too vast. Private charities ran out of money. Cities and states went bankrupt trying to provide relief. And still Hoover held fast to his principle. While the RFC was lending millions to a bank in Chicago, the federal government was refusing to provide a few dollars to a starving family in Ohio. This contradiction would be his undoing. While Hoover grappled with economic theory in the White House, the reality on the streets was one of deepening despair. By 1932, unemployment had soared to a staggering 25%. 1 in 4 working Americans was jobless. Families were evicted from their homes, and desperate homeless people began to construct shanty towns on the outskirts of cities. In a stroke of bitter, mocking genius, the public named them Hoovervilles. Newspapers became Hoover blankets. Empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags. The man who had once been a symbol of salvation had become a national byword for despair. His public persona only made things worse. He was a man of intense private emotions, but he was incapable of projecting empathy. He would work himself to exhaustion behind the closed doors of the White House, but when he faced the public, he was stiff, awkward, and spoke in the bloodless language of an engineer. He talked of liquidating labor, liquidating stocks, liquidating the farmers, while people listened for a word of comfort or hope. His shyness was mistaken for arrogance. His methodical approach was seen as heartless indifference. He became utterly isolated, a prisoner in the White House. He and his wife, Lou, to ensure their privacy, would often speak to each other in Mandarin Chinese, a language they had mastered years before. One can only imagine the desperate, whispered conversations they had in that foreign tongue, as the nation's hatred for him grew more intense with each passing day. The final blow to his presidency came in the sweltering summer of 1932, when an army of desperate veterans marched on Washington. They were the Bonus Army, some 20,000 World War I veterans, many now jobless and destitute. They had come to petition Congress for the early payment of a wartime bonus that was not due to be paid until 1945. They brought their families, set up an orderly encampment of tents and shacks at a place called Anacostia Flats, and waited. To Hoover, this army was not a symbol of national suffering, but a threat to public order, a mob instigated by communists. He refused to meet with their leaders. After Congress voted down their bonus bill, most of the veterans went home, but several thousand remained. After a scuffle between a few veterans and the police, Hoover made a fateful decision. He ordered the U.S. Army to clear the remaining protesters from government property. The man in charge of the operation was the imperious Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur. Dressed in full military regalia, MacArthur vastly exceeded his orders. He unleashed 4 troops of cavalry with drawn sabers, 6 tanks, and an infantry column with fixed bayonets upon the unarmed veterans. Tear gas filled the air, choking men, women, and children. The soldiers then marched across the bridge to Anacostia Flats, which was not part of their orders, and set the entire encampment ablaze. The images that flashed across the country were horrifying. American soldiers using military force attacking their own impoverished veterans. When the American flag burned above the shacks of the very men who had fought for it, Hoover's fate was sealed. He was no longer just viewed as incompetent. He was now seen as a brutal, heartless tyrant. In the presidential election of 1932, he was a man running against a ghost, the ghost of his own failed presidency. His opponent, the charismatic, ever-smiling governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, promised the American people a New Deal. Roosevelt was vague on the details, but he radiated optimism and a willingness to experiment. He offered hope. Hoover could only offer grim warnings about the dangers of government spending and the importance of a balanced budget. The result was a political annihilation. Hoover suffered one of the most crushing defeats in American history, carrying only 6 states. On March 4, 1933, exactly 4 years after he had taken the oath of office, he rode to Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration, sitting in stony silence beside the man who had vanquished him. The crowds that day were not cheering for the outgoing president. They were cheering for his departure. Herbert Hoover left the White House a profoundly broken man, his name forever chained to the Great Depression. The great humanitarian had become America's great scapegoat, his lifetime of incredible achievement erased, seemingly forever, by 4 years of unrelenting disaster. That collapse was marked by a final silent trip to Capitol Hill, the beginning of a new chapter of bitterness and loneliness. On March 4th, 1933, Herbert Hoover completed his last act as president. He sat in silence next to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the charismatic man who had not just defeated him, but had obliterated his political world. The 10-mile car ride from the White House to the Capitol was one of the most famously frigid in American history. As they passed crowds cheering wildly for the incoming president, Hoover, the outgoing one, was a ghost at the feast. He was 58 years old, but he looked a decade older, a man crushed by the weight of a national disaster. As he left the White House that day, he believed his life of public service was over. He was a political outcast, the most reviled man in America. His name was a punchline, his legacy seemingly set in stone as one of utter failure. He retreated from Washington, splitting his time between his home in Palo Alto, California, and an apartment in the Waldorf Astoria Towers in New York. He told a friend, "I'm a man of many troubles." For the next 12 years, he was sidelined from public life, watching as the new administration systematically dismantled everything he believed in. But Herbert Hoover was not a man who could remain silent. As Roosevelt's New Deal began to unfold, with its vast expansion of government programs, regulations, and federal power, Hoover became its most prominent and articulate critic. From his study, he wrote a series of books and essays and delivered countless speeches, arguing with all the force of his conviction that the New Deal was a monstrous betrayal of American principles. He saw it as a dangerous importation of European collectivism, a march to Moscow that was eroding the very foundations of liberty and individual initiative that had made America great. He wasn't just arguing about economics. For him, this was a battle for the nation's soul. He genuinely believed that the ever-growing bureaucracy of the New Deal would smother the spirit of self-reliance that he, the orphan from Iowa, held as the highest American virtue. To a nation desperate for help, however, his warnings sounded like the bitter ramblings of a failed leader. The Roosevelt administration and the Democratic Party continued to use him as a convenient scapegoat, blaming the Hoover Depression for every lingering economic ill. When he appeared in public, he was sometimes booed. He became a relic, a ghost of a bygone era that few cared to remember and fewer still dared to defend. These were long, lonely, and bitter years, a harsh exile for a man who had once been the world's savior. It seemed his story would end here as a footnote of opposition, a man left behind by history. But history, it turned out, was not quite finished with Herbert Hoover. In 1945, the world was once again in ruins. World War II had ended, leaving behind a landscape of unprecedented destruction. Across Europe and Asia, cities lay shattered, economies were non-existent, and hundreds of millions of people faced the specter of mass starvation, a famine that threatened to be even worse than the one that followed the First World War. In the White House, there was a new president, Harry S. Truman. Truman was a gruff, plain-spoken Democrat, a product of the New Deal who had spent years criticizing Hoover's policies. But he was also a pragmatist, and he knew that the world was facing a crisis that required a unique and proven expertise. He knew there was only one man alive who had ever successfully organized a global famine relief effort. And so in the spring of 1945, President Truman picked up the phone and made a stunning call to the Waldorf Astoria. He asked his old political enemy, Herbert Hoover, if he would be willing to serve his country once more. Hoover, then 71 years old, accepted without a moment's hesitation. For him, human suffering had always transcended politics. He soon embarked on a grueling, globe-spanning mission, undertaking a 50,000-mile journey to 38 countries to assess the food crisis firsthand. He traveled in cramped, unheated military transport planes, showing a physical toughness that astounded men half his age. He met with prime ministers, kings, and popes, but he also walked through the ruins of Warsaw and the slums of Cairo, his engineer's eye taking in the stark reality of the devastation. He returned to America and delivered his report. With the full backing of President Truman, he then helped design and coordinate the massive relief program that would feed a hungry world. The great humanitarian returned, summoned once more to save a starving world. The work he did in the aftermath of the Second World War saved countless millions from starvation. It was a quiet, stunning redemption. The man who had been cast out by his country was once again serving humanity, his name no longer a curse but a blessing. This act of service began a remarkable final chapter in Hoover's life. The respect he had earned from Truman led to another monumental task. Truman knew that the federal government, having grown enormously during the Depression and the war, had become a sprawling, inefficient, and often wasteful behemoth. In 1947, he asked Hoover to lead a bipartisan commission to study the entire executive branch and recommend ways to reorganize it. It was the perfect job for the great engineer. At the age of 73, Hoover plunged into the task with his old ferocious energy. For 2 years, he and his team, dubbed the Hoover Commission, dissected the inner workings of the U.S. government. They produced a series of brilliant reports making hundreds of specific recommendations to eliminate redundancy, streamline processes, and make the government more efficient and accountable. So successful was his work that a few years later, President Eisenhower asked him to lead a second Hoover Commission. Many of their recommendations were adopted, saving taxpayers billions of dollars and fundamentally reshaping the modern American government. It was his last great act of public service, a final magnificent application of his engineering mind to the nation's machinery. Through these acts, Hoover was transformed in the public eye. The bitter, reviled ex-president slowly faded from memory, replaced by the image of a revered elder statesman. He became a kind of grandfather to the nation, offering advice to sitting presidents and dedicating his final years to writing and to the institution that would carry his name and philosophy into the future, the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at his beloved Stanford University. He found solace in the quiet pursuits he had long enjoyed, especially fishing, about which he wrote several affectionate books. He outlived his beloved wife Lou by 2 decades, a deep and final personal sorrow. He lived to see the nation he had once led become the most powerful and prosperous in the world. He died on October 20th, 1964, at the age of 90, having lived one of the most consequential, contradictory, and ultimately tragic lives in American history. So how should we remember Herbert Hoover? To see him as a failed president is to ignore the complexity and extraordinary talent of the man he was. Before he entered the White House, he was a global hero, a humanitarian who saved millions of lives through his competence and integrity. His greatest tragedy is that the strengths that defined him, his unwavering belief in rugged individualism and his skepticism of government, became his fatal flaws in the face of the Great Depression. Trapped in the ideological prison of his self-made orphanhood, he was unable to enact the collective solutions that the times demanded. His failure was not a matter of character, but of a vision limited by 19th century values. His life is a timeless lesson in how circumstances can turn a hero into a villain. To understand Hoover, you have to see the whole story. The orphan who became a savior, the savior who became a scapegoat, and the scapegoat who, in the end, found a quiet redemption. It's a profound story about a great but tragic American life.